Let's talk now about another very important subject in this process of preparing the files at Unreal, which is about the mapping of the U channel. Um, let's open the layers so that we can see the whole project again. But this project here, we don't need to use it because it won't go to Unreal. A very important thing is to map the number one map to take the project to Unreal. The reason it's important, actually, it's not really essential, but you don't need to do it, but it's a good strategy to do it for some objects based on basically one criteria. Which one? Let me show you what is the mapping of the number one channel. I'm gonna show it to you on Unreal, okay? When we talk about materials, we will create a load that will make it easier. The texture scale. I can increase or decrease the texture scale directly on Unreal. And to do it, it's easier if we leave the channel mapped in a square shape, mapped 1 by 1, 1 meter for 1 meter, or 100 centimeters for 100 centimeters, okay? And what's the criterion that I'm going to use to define if this object needs to be mapped in 1 for 1? Let me open a parenthesis here. When we talk about Unreal Engine 5, we have basically using the Lumen technology in a night that we're going to talk about it there when we get to Unreal Engine 5. When we talk about Unreal Engine 5, if we use the Lumen technology, we don't need to open the mesh, which means that we don't need to open the number 2 channel. By using Unreal Engine 4, the light information, a thing that we call build, is stored in the number 2 channel of our model. When we talk about Unreal 5, specifically talking about Lumen, everything happens in a dynamic way. The rays or tracing, everything happens instantly, so we don't need to store the light information that is the build result, the render result in the number 2 channel. We don't need the number 2 channel. Basically, we just need the number 1 channel. And the number 1 channel is responsible to store the texture. When you are inside 3ds Max or Blender or Maya, for example, you apply the texture in your model, right? You open the materials, you, in this case, suck the material, apply a texture, and put it on your model. When you do it, you're applying this texture in the number 1 channel of your model. For example, let me isolate this. If I apply a modifier here called unwrap, you don't need to do it, okay? Just because I want to show it to you what Max does. When you put a texture or a wood, for example, a wood, when you put a wood here, the 3ds Max is using for standard the number 1 channel of your object. Look at this. So it is mapping the number 1 channel. Let's open the editor. Look at this. Obviously, the mesh is not open. It's not mapped in a way that the cuts are correct and the mesh has been thought out at the time of opening. As we are talking about the masonry, the ceiling of our project, we don't need to map specifically each area, not for this project. But obviously, if you have an armature or some model within your project that you need to do a specific mapping of channel 1, then you will do a specific mapping here inside the UV editor. But even though it will be mapped in the number 1 channel, okay? When you talk about Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5, there are many ways to process the lights and the materials and the bouncing inside there. You have dynamic lights, you have dynamic light, you have the build process, you have the DA looming key. There are several ways to do the same thing. In this course here, specifically, we're going to talk about the looming technology, where there is no necessity to do the render of this light. When we talk about Unreal 4 and Unreal 5 using the build technology, we need of the number 2 channel to store the light information when we're using the build process. But in our case, we use the looming process, the looming technology, where everything, calculations, bounces, direct lights, indirect lights are done dynamically, which means in a real time. Using this technology, or ray tracing, which is also possible to use there, there is no need to open the channel 2, okay? So in our course here, we'll only worry about the number 1 channel, okay? If you want to get to know more about this function, how to use the number 2 channel, or if you are going to do a build process, you can have access to the Unreal Engine 4 course. I'll leave the link below. You don't need to buy it unless you want to learn how to use Unreal Engine 4. Soon, I'll make a video for you, okay, about good practices, explaining why to use one version, why to use the other, when to use the version 4, when to use the version 5, okay? So for this course here, we'll stick to Unreal Engine 5 with looming lighting technology, okay? Where it's not necessary to use the number 2 channel. And if I, for example, I abandon here, look at this. I don't have the mapping done here in the number 2 channel, just on the number 1 channel. So if we were to use, for example, a build in Unreal Engine 4 or a build in Unreal Engine 5, we would have to worry about also mapping channel 2, okay? But it's not going to be necessary because we're going to do it on Unreal Engine 5 using looming, okay? Cool. Let's get back to the number 1 channel. So all the materials that you apply on your model, it goes to number 1 channel, okay? What is interesting that you do? Well, you leave the number 1 channel mapped in 1 by 1 in 100 centimeters for 100 centimeters, because it's going to make it easier when you need to increase or decrease the repetition of the texture inside Unreal. It's a good tip, because if, for example, let's take it off the ceiling, let's take the floor, it's going to make more sense. Look, the floor of the house. Let's think that in our project, it's a white floor. Okay, let's take a material here, white floor, and let's apply it here, the material. Cool. Let's think that you want inside Unreal. Let's assume that you want to create an interaction inside Unreal where your client, your project will allow the exchange of materials. At some point, you will place the wooden material. It's interesting for your material to be mapped 1 by 1. Why? Because if you want to increase the wood grains, for example, there at Unreal, you can do it without having to go back to 3ds Max and adjust here. Look at this. We can increase or decrease the wood grains, correct? Inside the 3ds Max. Perfect. You also can do it inside Unreal, but it's interesting if you leave a pattern, because there we will learn that when we go to create the materials, we will create a master material, which will be our main material, and we want other repeats of material based on that master material. So you think with me, if you have a floor where its mapping is 1 by 1, you use the wood texture for this floor. Uh, that and then you go to another element. For example, this wall here, it's where the mapping, you're going to apply the same texture, same wood texture, and it's 2.5 for 1. So you want to apply the same texture, wood texture, in another element, a random element, where the mapping is 0.5 or 5 centimeters for 50 centimeters. It's going to be really complicated, and we will have to create a lot of materials with different measures, and that's going to be confusing, and you will be disorganized inside the reel. So it's cool always that is possible mapping in 1 by 1, because when you put a wood texture on the floor, uh, that will also work on the floor, also on the glass, uh, also the other thing with the same repetition, same time, because all the models were modeled in the same measure. But that's for sure, there are some exceptions. For example, let's suppose you have the armchair. Let's see here. Let's suppose you have this armchair, and on this chair specifically, it has a specific mapping. Look, I have this direction here, another one here. So it doesn't make sense to put, for example, the 1 for 1 mapping, because you will screw this up. Okay, this model is going to be screwed up. So look at this. It's not really cool. So it does make sense, because here it's really specific, the mapping type, and you probably will not change the wood grains. And so that's okay to create another material, because this is a really specific object. Okay, so okay, but in the general objects like wall, floors, pergola, things that are in general that you can possibly increase or decrease the texture repeat size, it's interesting if you leave it mapped in 1 for 1. So let's do it. Okay, I'm going to explain how you can do it. Control plus Z, or you can simply delete the modifier.